Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Lisa and we are here for our very final project on Sewing for the Family. We're going to learn how to quilt. Quilting is an art, centuries old, but it's still alive to this day, and it's a very nice skill to know because once you know how to quilt, you can make so many blankets, accessories, pillows, and gifts for everyone. So we're just going to learn the basics here. We're going to make a very simple block quilt. And what I like about this particular project is it's kind of sticking with our upcycling theme. This quilt is made from all of my scraps of fabric, because a lot of times when you sew, your scraps become, you just get so many, and then they just build up. They sit in a corner, because I always feel guilty throwing away scraps. So this is a great use for them. So what I did is I just found several different scraps that I liked and all the colors matched, and I cut out enough squares to work with. So in just a moment I'll go into details with the materials used, but I just want you to know that feel free and get all your scraps out on the table, or hey, maybe you don't have any scraps yet and you can go ahead and go to the store, get a bunch of fabrics that you really like, and let's get right into it. So the materials I'm going to use, I've got my rotary blade and my cutting mat, which I prefer over the fabric shears. It just makes slicing up all those little squares a bit easier. And then just a basic pencil for marking, a ruler, and my snips. We'll also be using a sewing machine and an iron and an ironing board. For the fabric used, it depends on how big you want your quilt to be. Mine's going to be pretty small. I have cut out a square. This will be the back of our quilt. So this is about the size it's going to be. So once you know that size, think about the measurements. What I have done is I have 4 different squares of 4 different colors that are 4 inches by 4 inches each, because I want to make a square, so I want to work with that nice even number. You can do the same, or you can grow your size or shrink your size however you would like. But yeah, I just cut these out from our scraps using my ruler and marking everything to be the right size. And then with that number in mind, because I know that, let's do some quick math, 4 by 4 is 16 inches, and this happens to be 18 inches wide, because we always want our back to be a bit bigger than the front pieces to make sure everything fits, since we're going to cut it before we finish. And with that, we also have our binding, which we want to be the size of the width of our back, which here we have 18 inches. So my binding is 18 inches times 4, so it can fit all the way around the perimeter. And then I added a few extra inches just in case. So that might have been that's a lot of numbers for you to take in right now. So go ahead and take your time and do some quick math and figure out what size is going to work best for you. Cut out all the stuff you will need. We're also going to use batting to make our quilt nice and soft. I have some of that over here. And this is everything you'll need, and we'll get right into quilting. So first up, we want to arrange all of our squares into a pretty way that we would like them to appear on the quilt itself. So what I'm going to do is just take everything out and then play with it, kind of like a puzzle, but I get to determine the final look. So I'm just going to lay them all out and then arrange them. I always like spontaneity in my designs. I'm going to purposefully scatter them so it looks like I just threw them into place, but really they're all intentionally put somewhere. So let's see how this is going to work out. That's kind of cool. So that just took a few minutes of arranging and rearranging, and I think I'm happy with the way this looks. So now that we have this in mind, I'm just going to carefully set them aside. And now we get into the real step one of quilting. You always begin by making your rows. So what I'm going to do is sew the sides together of each row individually, and then we sew our rows together. I have prepared my first row of quilt squares. I've just pinned them together very basically, and something else to always keep in mind when you're sewing is you want right sides to be together, and so then when you turn it over, everything looks correct. Also, something that I've been doing is maybe when I was cutting out my squares, they weren't perfectly 4 inches by 4 inches. So what I do want to make sure is that the center of all of our squares lines up. So if there's some sticking out on the top, that's okay, as long as the center is all 4 inches in line. I have my fabric piece now in the machine. I'm using a straight stitch and a 2.5 inch stitch length. And I'm sewing on the 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is much smaller than the ones we've used in the past. And that is so we don't interfere with any of our nice, pretty quilt squares. Now we have our first little row of quilt pieces. I'm going to repeat the same process for all 4 rows. All right, so we have now added all of our rows. What we're going to do is just clean them up a bit. We've got so many loose threads everywhere. And then we also need to press our seams open. So I'm just going to take some time with my scissors, get rid of all that fuss. We don't need more fuss in our lives. Okay, so that looks a little better. Now I'm going to take these pieces and I'm not going to press open the seams, but I'm going to press them all to be the same way so that they fall flat and even. Now we get to sew together every row. What I'm going to do is just take the first ones. Let me make sure I like this. Yes, that's correct. That's how it's supposed to look. And then I just take the first row, and with right sides together, I'm going to line up the seams as best I can. Now I understand this is our first time making a quilt. They're just scrap pieces, so the seams might not line up perfectly. The sign of a true quilter, a true quality quilter, is their seams do line up. However, I kind of like the idea of, being a little messy, and I don't think all of our seams will do that. So I'm just pinning them all together. Then we're going to sew down the edge. You're going to use the same 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now what happened here, you'll see my line is straight, and then some fabric pieces have extended over the edge. That's because this one was a bit longer. So that is great because at least the inside seam is a straight line. That's what we want. That's what's most important. And now we just add our next one. Double checking. Yes, this is how it's going to be. And we want our right sides together again. And we're just going to build on from where we started. The seams that I am focusing most on lining up is the very middle seam. As long as the middle is the right size, everything else will fit. I'm making sure that as I sew over every seam allowance that it stays facing the correct way. Now we've got our quilt here. All the pieces have been patched together. I'm just going to repeat what we did earlier, where I press all of these the same way and clean up all my stitches. It's a little better. I'm going to take it over here and press everything the same way. So I'm just testing. Folks, remember when you're using your iron, always test a small part of fabric or a scrap fabric that can get ruined, because sometimes the heat on your iron will melt the fabric, and then that sucks because then you have to start over, or you'll have a huge hole or burn mark on the piece you're working with, which I have done many times. So always, always, always test your fabric first, please. Especially like with this quilt, for example, one of the fabrics I'm working with does have a bit of a coating on it, so it is more prone to burning than the other pieces. So with that in mind, I'm using a lower setting on my iron just to be careful. There we go. Now that looks a little better now, doesn't it? Now it's time to add our backing. So I've got the back of my quilt as well as all of the batting. Now this batting I mentioned it's a little clumpier than the kind you usually would work with a quilt, because I'm working with scrap material. Typically your quilt backing would be maybe a nice sheet, and this is more a nice puff. But I'm going to work with what we have. I'm going to probably take some out, set it to the side. And I'm just going to focus on just filling this entire piece. My fabric is right side down on the table. And I'm just going to fill this entire piece with the stuffing. I'm going to try to make it as even as possible. Okay, so what I've done is just coated the entire piece with a layer of the batting. I want it to extend beyond the edges. I want the whole thing to be filled. All of it. Oh yeah, that is gonna be so cozy. Okay, a little bit here, a little bit up there. Looks good. Then what we do is, this part is the fun part. We've got our fluffy cloud all laid out. Next up, we place our quilt face up over it. And all of this extra fabric and fluff that is extending over is terrific. We want that there because as we sew this on, the padding might move around a little, so the more we have to work with leaning over, the better. So what I do at this point is pin my sides together, front to back. I'm just gently lifting my fabric and pinning them just basically to hold them in place. We're not going to be sewing over this part. What we will be top stitching them all in place though. It's going to be quite an adventure, because the difference here in sewing, what we've never done before, is we're top stitching without worrying about the seam allowance. Well, it's a different kind of seam allowance that we'll be focusing on. So I have everything pinned, and I'm going to work from the right side to the left side on all of my seams. I'm going to sew over each seam with a 1/4 inch allowance on either side, just to outline all of my squares. We've got one seam sewn. Gonna just work our way across the rest of the quilt. I'm just going to move any of the batting that is coming out to the side. That is why we used extra batting when we were stuffing it. All right, we've got our first inside seam sewn. All I got to do is rotate this guy and keep on going. I have now top stitched all of my little squares together. Now what I'm going to do is top stitch along the perimeter of my front just to hold everything in place, and then I can cut off the bulk. I'll just start on one corner and work my way around. Now folks, you might notice that as I reach every corner, instead of taking your needle over the edge and starting over, you actually can just leave your needle in the machine, just at the edge where your seam allowance would be, and then lift up your presser foot, rotate your fabric the 90 degrees, and continue on your way. I am backstitching a little at each corner just to reinforce that, that thread. We learned this when we were doing our napkins, and it's a great, helpful technique to use after every corner. All right, we went all the way around. Now I'm just going to fix this all up nice and pretty, remove all my pins, remove any stitches that got caught under each other, and we are on our way. We've got everything ready. We're going to take our rotary blade and we're just going to slice off the overlaying fabrics that we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance to work with. I'm slicing directly over everything. Getting that gross stuff out of here. All right, so this binding I cut out from a solid fabric. I cut out 2.5 inches in width, and then if I didn't have enough length, what I did is I added more by, I'll show you. I did about 20 times 4, so 80 inches long. I took one strip, I laid it this way, I took the other strip, and I laid it this way, and I sewed down the diagonal, and then I sliced it off with my blade, and then I had a nice straight line so that this would be the length I needed. And we're going to pretend this binding works just like bias tape. You might remember we used bias tape during one of our earlier projects. The idea is that you get to encase all of your edges and no one's ever gonna see them again. Beautiful. So what we do is pin our right sides together. I'm gonna start somewhere in the middle, and I'm going to pin this guy in place. When I get to the corner, I'm just going to fold this and keep working down. So I'll have an edge like this. Just like that, guys. I'm going to do the same thing to all 4 corners. And I want a little bit of overlap here. So as you can see here, I'm overlapping my binding just a bit. Okay, and since I've overlapped that, I'm just going to cut off all of the parts that I don't need anymore. Boop, boop. Meow, meow. We're going to take this into our machine and using the 1/2 inch seam allowance to cover up or attach all of the binding to the back side of our quilt. So I've sewn the back side, and this is how it looks from the front now. What we're going to do is turn this over like that so it stays. We're going to fold it under itself and then top stitch it all in place. But first, I must clip my corners. So that means just clip away at any chunks that you have where the seam turns, because now you'll have a nice crisp corner to work with. So we turn this over poke out our corners. We're gonna fold it in half and then in half again. So it'll rest there. So let me pin that in place and just work my way all the way around, pinning it in place. I'm gonna pin this way so it stays. And then we'll stitch it up. Stitch it up. Okay, I've pinned my everything. I'm just going to sew right along the folded edge here, all the way around. So now I have top stitched all the way around. It is so close to being done, isn't it cute? So all I have left is I'm just going to take it over to my ironing board over here. Get that side ironed. I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think the front and the back look great. I hope that yours turned out well too. I would love to see any pictures that you have. You can go ahead and share them with me. Tag me on Twitter or Instagram with your picture. My handle is @ItsaLisa, ITSA_Lisa. You can also send me any pictures or ask me any questions or comments in the links provided below. Let's go over what we've learned. How to upcycle and how to take old fabrics or old clothes and breathe new life into them to make them re-wearable or rework them around your home or build a lovely quilt out of those old fabrics. We have also discussed how to sew for the home and how to make some profit with that as well. So I hope you've learned a lot. I sure have enjoyed teaching you, and I'm so glad you're here learning with us. So we've reached the end of this tutorial. However, if there is anything that I haven't discussed about sewing for the home, do feel free to contact us, maybe send some suggestions our way, and I would be happy to show you some more things in the future. I'll see you next time. And remember, the more you sew, the more you know. Hello everyone, my name's Lisa and welcome to the tutorial on sewing for the family. I'm here in our maker studio where we make all sorts of tutorials for you. So do excuse any noises you hear in the background, it's just my friends also making their tutorials.